You know, if you really want to understand American foreign policy today, everything from the pivot to Asia to the war in Ukraine, you have to get inside the mind of one man, Zbigniew Brzezinski. He wasn't just a strategist, he was a grandmaster, and he saw the entire globe as one giant chessboard. In this explainer, we are going to dive deep into his legendary book, The Grand Chessboard, and see how his strategy, decades later, is still the playbook for the moves that shape our world.
All right, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with Brzezinski's legacy, who he was and why he matters. Then we'll get into the core of his whole theory, the Eurasian chessboard. From there, we'll look at his key ideas of players versus pivots, and see how modern guys like Tom Donilon actually put these ideas into action. We'll also cover Europe's crucial role in all of this. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at where this great geopolitical game is headed. So first, let's just set the stage. Zbigniew Brzezinski wasn't just some other talking head or national security advisor. He was what policymakers today still call him, a grand chess master. The man thought in terms of massive historical forces, entire systems, and long-term strategy. And that perspective really shaped America's entire worldview after the Cold War.
And look, this isn't just some dusty historical footnote. This is a quote from Tom Donilon, who was national security advisor under President Obama. He's making it crystal clear just how massive Brzezinski's influence was. And that direct line, from the guy who architected Cold War strategy to the people running 21st century policy, well, that's exactly what makes this framework so incredibly powerful today.
So, what was Brzezinski's big idea? Well, it all boils down to one single massive piece of land. For him, the entire game of global power, of world dominance, is played out on one board: Eurasia.
Just look at this map. This is what Brzezinski called the axial supercontinent. His whole argument was that throughout all of human history, whoever controlled this landmass controlled the world. America's totally unique position as the first global power that wasn't from Eurasia made managing this chessboard its #1 job.
And the sheer scale of this place, it's just staggering. You're talking about 75% of all the people in the world, 60% of the world's entire economic output, and 3/4 of all known energy resources. So it's not just a big chunk of land, right? It's the absolute center of gravity for human power and wealth. And what that really means is simple. You cannot be a global power if you are not a major player in Eurasia, period. And right here, Brzezinski lays out the ultimate prize. If you can dominate Eurasia, you automatically get decisive influence over the economic engines of both Europe and Asia. And by doing that, you essentially control the fate of Africa and the Middle East too. So for the United States, the main goal was suddenly crystal clear: do whatever it takes to prevent any single rival from dominating this all-important space.
But Brzezinski didn't just see one big, flat board. He saw different kinds of pieces, each with its own special role. He actually broke down the nations of Eurasia into two really key categories, and you have to understand this distinction to see how his strategy actually works.
First, you have what he called the geostrategic players. You can think of these as the really powerful, active pieces on the board: your rooks, your knights, your queens. We're talking about nations like Russia, China, Germany, and India. They've got the muscle and, crucially, the ambition to actually change the game.
And then you've got the geopolitical pivots. Now, these are different. Think of them less as powerful pieces and more like the most critical squares on the board. They might not have the raw power of a player, but their location is so incredibly important that their status, whether they're stable or independent or fall under someone else's control, can completely change the balance of power for everybody else.
This table here makes that distinction really clear. The players, like China, are actively trying to shape the board to their advantage. But the pivots, like Ukraine, just because of where they sit on the map, can become these catalysts that totally shift the game. So U.S. strategy suddenly becomes this two-part mission. On one hand, you manage the big ambitions of the powerful players, and on the other, you secure the stability and freedom of these absolutely critical pivots.
Okay, so that's the theory. But how does this Cold War-era thinking actually get used in a world with totally new challenges? Well, this is where Tom Donilon and the Obama administration's pivot to Asia comes in. It is a perfect, direct application of Brzezinski's logic for our time.
See, under Donilon's watch, there was a very deliberate strategic shift. For a decade after 9/11, U.S. foreign policy was just all consumed by counterterrorism in the Middle East. Donilon's strategy was to rebalance away from that and toward the primary arena for great power competition in the 21st century, the Asia-Pacific, the eastern flank of Brzezinski's grand chessboard. And that right there is the key takeaway. The main opponent on the board changed, sure,
But the board itself and the fundamental strategy, they didn't. The goal wasn't containing the Soviet Union anymore. It was about managing the rise of a new geostrategic player, China. It was pure Brzezinskian realism, just updated for a new century.
But hold on, what about the other side of the board? For this whole strategy to actually work, the US needed a really stable and powerful foothold on the western edge of Eurasia. And this is where Europe's role becomes absolutely, fundamentally critical.
Brzezinski saw Europe as America's democratic bridgehead. Think about it. A strong, united Europe, anchored by an alliance like NATO, accomplishes a whole bunch of goals at once. It projects American influence right onto the continent, it serves as a wall against any single power trying to dominate the region, and it expands the reach of democracy. Without that bridgehead, the whole chessboard just falls apart.
And this brings us to one of Brzezinski's most famous, and frankly, most startlingly on-point quotes. He saw Ukraine as the ultimate geopolitical pivot. He argued that its independence fundamentally changes what Russia is and what it can become, preventing it from ever being a true continent-spanning empire again. I mean, that quote just shows you how incredibly high the stakes are when a key pivot state like that is in play.
So let's step back. When you put all of these pieces together, what do you see? You see this clear, unbroken line of strategic thought that directly connects the Cold War to the biggest challenges we face today. The game, the chess game, it endures even when the players and the moves on the board change.
This is that strategic evolution in action. Brzezinski gives us the core thesis. Controlling Eurasia is everything. Then Donnellan provides the modern application. Shift your resources to manage China, the new key player on that board. And the result, the synthesis of all this, is an agile, long-term grand strategy that's focused on one core principle. Never let a peer competitor arise in Eurasia.
And this, of course, leaves us with the big, lingering question. Brzezinski's whole framework was really designed for an era of unmatched American power. But today, as new powers arise and the world gets more and more multipolar, is it even possible for a single nation to act as the grandmaster of this vast, complex board anymore? Or is the very nature of the game itself beginning to change? That is the strategic challenge for the next generation of figures.